From the final chapter of Zuckerman Unbound, his father's funeral. The funeral was a tremendous strain. There was the heat, for one thing. Over the Miami cemetery, the sun made its presence known to Zuckerman as no Yahweh ever had. Had it been the sun they were all addressing, he might have entered into the death rites of his people with something more than just respect for his mother's feelings. The two sons had to support her between them from the moment they left the air-conditioned limousine and started down between a row of twirling sprinklers to the burial plot. Dr. Zuckerman had bought 2 plots, for himself and for his wife, 6 years earlier, the same week he'd bought their condominium in Harbor Beach Retirement Village. Her knees gave way by the grave, but as she had been worn down by her husband's illness to little more than 100 pounds, it was no problem for Henry and Nathan to keep her on her feet until the coffin was lowered and they could take refuge from the heat. Behind him, Zuckerman heard Essie tell Mr. Metz, "All the words, all the sermons, all the quotations, and no matter what they say, it's still final." Earlier, stepping from the limousine, she had turned to Zuckerman to give her assessment of the journey out for the man in the hearse. "You take a ride and you don't get to see the scenery." Yes, Essie and he were the ones who'd say anything. Zuckerman, his brother, and the rabbi were by decades the youngest men present. The rest of them wilting there were either his parents' elderly neighbors from Harbor Beach or Newark cronies of his father's who'd also retired to Florida. A few had even been boys with Dr. Zuckerman in the Central Ward before the First World War. Most of them Zuckerman hadn't seen since his childhood, when they'd been men not much older than he was now. He listened to the familiar voices coming out of the lined and jowled and fallen faces, thinking, if only I were still writing Karnofsky. What memories those tones touched off. The Charlton Street baths and the Lakewood vacations, the fishing expeditions to the Shark River Inlet down the shore. Before the funeral, everybody had come up to put their arms around him. Nobody mentioned the book. Probably none of them had read it. Of all the obstacles in life that these retired salesmen and merchants and manufacturers had struggled with and overcome, reading through a book was not yet one. Just as well. Not even the young rabbi made mention of Karnofsky to the author. Perhaps out of respect for the dead. All the better. He was not there as the author. The author was back in Manhattan. Here he was Nathan. Sometimes life offers no more powerful experience than just such a divestment. He recited the mourner's Kaddish. Over a sinking coffin, even a non-believer needs some words to chant, and Yiskadal v'Yiskadash made more sense to him than rage against the dying of the light. If ever there was a man to bury as a Jew, it was his father. Nathan would probably wind up letting them bury him as one, too. Better as that than as a bohemian. "My 2 boys," said his mother, as they lifted her along the path back to the car. "My 2 tall, strong, handsome boys." Returning through Miami to the apartment, the limousine stopped for a light just by a supermarket. The women shoppers, most of them middle-aged and Cuban, were wearing halters and shorts and high-heeled sandals. A lot of protoplasm to take in, straight from the post-retirement village of the dead. He saw Henry looking, too. A halter had always seemed to Zuckerman a particularly provocative piece of attire. Cloth, not quite clothing. But the only thought inspired by these women oozing flesh was of his father decomposing. He'd been unable to think of much else since earlier in the day, when the family had taken seats together in the first row at the temple, and the young rabbi, bearded very like Che Guevara, began to extol from the altar the virtues of the deceased. The rabbi praised him not simply as father, husband, and family man, but as a political being engaged by all of life and anguished by the suffering of mankind. He spoke of the many magazines and newspapers Dr. Zuckerman had subscribed to and studied, the countless letters of protest he had painstakingly composed, He spoke of his enthusiasm for American democracy, his passion for Israel's survival, his revulsion against the carnage in Vietnam, his fears for the Jews in the Soviet Union, and meanwhile, all Zuckerman was thinking was the word extinguished. All that respectable moralizing, all that repressive sermonizing, all those superfluous prohibitions, that furnace of pieties, that Lucifer of rectitude, that Hercules of misunderstanding, extinguished. Strange. It was supposed to be just the opposite. But never had he contemplated his father's life with less sentiment. It was as though they were burying the father of some other sons. As for the character being depicted by the rabbi, well, nobody had ever gotten Dr. Zuckerman quite so wrong. Maybe the rabbi was only trying to distance him from the father in Karnofsky. But from the portrait he painted, you would have thought Dr. Zuckerman was Schweitzer. All that was missing was the organ and the lepers. But why not? Whom did it harm? It was a funeral, not a novel, let alone the Last Judgment. What made it such a strain? Aside from the unrelenting heat in their lost, defenseless, seemingly legless mother? Aside from the pitiful sight of those old family friends looking down into the slot where they too must be deposited 30, 60, 90 days hence? The kibitzing giants out of his earliest memories, so frail now, some of them, that despite the healthy suntans, you could have pushed them in with his father and they couldn't have crawled out. Aside from all this, there was his emotions. The strain of feeling no grief, the surprise, the shame, the exultation, the shame of that. But all the grieving over his father's body had taken place when Nathan was 12 and 15 and 21. The grief over all his father had been dead to while living. From that grief, the death was a release. By the time he boarded the Newark plane with Henry, it felt like a release from even more. He couldn't entirely explain, or manage to control, this tide of euphoria sweeping him away from all inane distractions. It was very likely the same heady feeling of untrammeled freedom that people like Mary and Andre had been expecting him to enjoy from becoming a household name. In fact, it had rather more to do with the 4-day strain of Florida, with the wholly un-inane exigencies of arranging for the burial of one parent and the survival of the other, that had put the household name and the Hallelujah chorus behind him. He had become himself again, though with something unknowable added. He was no longer any man's son. Forget fathers, he told himself. Plural.